In the heart of Hitler's war machine, a group of his own officers prepared to kill him, not for power, but to save Germany from itself. What drove men sworn to obey to risk everything in a single, doomed act of conscience? This is the true story of Operation Valkyrie, the plot to end the Führer's reign from within. The roots of Operation Valkyrie trace back to the internal contradictions of Nazi Germany itself. From 1933 onward, Adolf Hitler's consolidation of power eliminated legal opposition while simultaneously binding the army, the civil service, and the population to his personal authority. The Oath of Allegiance, introduced in August 1934, required all soldiers to swear loyalty not to the nation, but to the Führer personally. This act turned the Wehrmacht into a political instrument and made dissent a form of treason. Yet within the German elite, especially among conservative officers, diplomats, and administrators, unease grew as the regime's policies turned increasingly radical. Some saw Hitler's aggression as a danger to Germany's survival rather than its salvation. During the years before the war, a small circle of senior officers and officials began to consider removing Hitler from power. Among them were General Ludwig Beck, former chief of the General Staff, and Ulrich von Hassel, the German ambassador to Italy. Both were alarmed by Hitler's reckless foreign policy, particularly the planned invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1938. Their hope was that by replacing the Führer, Germany might avoid a catastrophic conflict with Britain and France. The so-called Oster Conspiracy, led by Colonel Hans Oster of the Abwehr, attempted to coordinate a coup should the Wehrmacht be ordered to attack Czechoslovakia. Plans included arresting Hitler and establishing a provisional government headed by conservative politicians. However, the Munich Agreement of September 1938, which granted Hitler his territorial demands without war, destroyed the conspirators' credibility. The apparent diplomatic triumph left them isolated and disillusioned. As the war began in 1939, the balance of power shifted further toward the regime. Early victories in Poland, France, and the Low Countries silenced most internal criticism. The opposition, limited to a few officers and bureaucrats, lacked both unity and opportunity. Nevertheless, key networks survived within the Army's General Staff and the Intelligence Service. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, quietly shielded dissenters, while Oster continued to collect information about war crimes committed by the SS and security forces in occupied territories. Reports of mass executions and atrocities hardened the resolve of certain officers who had once supported the regime out of patriotism. By 1941, Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union expanded both the scale of the war and the moral crisis within the officer corps. The brutal treatment of prisoners, the mass shootings by Einsatzgruppen, and the ideological nature of the campaign convinced many that Hitler's leadership endangered not only Germany's moral integrity, but its very survival. Resistance, however, remained fragmented. Civilian opponents like Karl Goerdeler, former mayor of Leipzig, envisioned a post-Hitler constitutional monarchy, while military figures such as Beck and Henning von Treschow focused on restoring national honor through decisive action. Their cooperation grew slowly, hindered by surveillance, fear, and the regime's unbroken military success. The illusion of invincibility collapsed, and pragmatic resistance began to merge with moral opposition. Officers within Army Group Center, including von Treschow and Fabian von Schlabrendorf, started planning concrete measures to kill Hitler. Their aim was no longer negotiation with the Allies, but the physical removal of the Führer to save Germany from total destruction. By 1943, the core of what would later become the Valkyrie network had taken shape. A coalition of disillusioned generals, conservative bureaucrats, and members of the German aristocracy who combined patriotic duty with ethical conviction. Operation Valkyrie itself would emerge not as a purely conspiratorial invention, but as a modification of an existing Army emergency plan. Originally designed to secure internal order in case of unrest, it would be transformed into a blueprint for overthrowing the Nazi regime. To understand how such a plot could arise within the heart of the Wehrmacht, it is essential to trace the gradual erosion of loyalty that began long before July 1944, a process driven by fear, conscience, and the growing recognition that Germany's fate was inseparable from the fate of its dictator. The outbreak of World War II in September 1939 marked a temporary silencing of internal opposition in Germany. The swift and decisive victories of the Wehrmacht in Poland and Western Europe created a wave of public euphoria and strengthened Hitler's position beyond challenge. Many officers who had privately doubted him found themselves carried by the momentum of success. The regime appeared invincible, and resistance became synonymous with betrayal. However, as the conflict expanded and the consequences of Hitler's strategic decisions grew apparent, a small group of officers and officials began to view him as the primary obstacle to Germany. In 1940 and 1941, opposition networks survived mainly within the intelligence service, the Abwehr, and the high command of the army. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris and Colonel Hans Oster used their positions to protect individuals under suspicion and to maintain discreet contacts with foreign diplomats. Oster in particular warned his associates that Hitler's war was leading Germany toward annihilation. General Ludwig Beck, though retired, served as a symbolic leader for these circles. In parallel, civilians such as Karl Gordeler and members of the Kreisau Circle, an intellectual resistance group led by Helmuth James von Moltke, debated possible post-war political structures. Their visions differed. Some wanted a constitutional monarchy, others a Christian-based democracy. What united them was the belief that Germany needed to be freed from the dictatorship before the entire nation was destroyed. The turning point for renewed military opposition came with Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. Reports from the Eastern Front documented mass executions of civilians and prisoners of war, conducted under the pretext of racial policy and anti-partisan warfare. Officers such as Henning von Tresckow, serving on the staff of Army Group Center, were appalled by what they witnessed. They concluded that the regime's crimes would bring both moral ruin and strategic collapse. By 1942, von Tresckow had begun organizing a network of like-minded officers who shared the goal of removing Hitler by force. This marked the transition from passive disapproval to active conspiracy. The first assassination attempts were planned in 1943. On 13th of March, during Hitler's visit to Army Group Center headquarters at Smolensk, von Tresckow arranged to smuggle a bomb aboard the Führer's aircraft. The device, disguised as a package of liquor bottles, failed to detonate because of a malfunctioning detonator in the extreme cold. Despite the failure, the conspirators were not discovered. In another attempt in December of the same year, Colonel Axel von dem Busche prepared to demonstrate new uniforms to Hitler while carrying explosives concealed beneath his coat. That visit was canceled after an air raid destroyed the uniforms. Each failure deepened the conspirators' sense of urgency and their realization that time was running out. At the same time, practical obstacles limited the reach of resistance. The Gestapo's surveillance was extensive, and trust within the army was fragile. The majority of officers still obeyed Hitler's orders without question. Moreover, the war's brutality had hardened attitudes. Fear of Soviet retribution and loyalty to comrades often outweighed political conviction. Even within the opposition, some conspirators sought a negotiated peace with the Western Allies while continuing the war against the Soviet Union. Others wanted a complete end to hostilities on all fronts. These divisions weakened coordination and delayed action. By mid-1943, however, the situation on the battlefield and at home made the necessity of action undeniable. Germany had lost the Sixth Army at Stalingrad, suffered defeats in North Africa, and faced growing Allied air raids on its cities. Hitler's insistence on holding every position regardless of cost led to further military disasters. the conspirators realized that removing him would not only be a moral act, but also a strategic imperative to save what remained of the nation. As plans matured, they began to search for a figure who could act decisively, with both access to Hitler and the determination to carry out the assassination personally. That search would soon lead them to a wounded veteran recovering from his injuries, Colonel Klaus Schenk Graf von Stauffenberg, the man who would give Operation Valkyrie its fateful chance. Klaus Schenk Graf von Stauffenberg emerged as a central figure in the conspiracy during 1943, a year when Germany's strategic situation had turned decisively against the Reich. Born in 1907 into an aristocratic Catholic family in southern Germany, Stauffenberg had been deeply loyal to the army and to the idea of German honor. Initially, like many officers, he admired aspects of Hitler's restoration of national strength. However, after witnessing the destruction on the Eastern Front and learning of the atrocities committed against civilians, his allegiance shifted from the Führer to the concept of duty to the German people. From late 1943 to early 1944, Stauffenberg and his associates worked to refine this concept. Their objectives were divided into three stages. First, kill Hitler, ideally during one of his conferences at the Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia. Second, activate Valkyrie and secure control of Berlin, Vienna, and other major cities. Third, establish a provisional government headed by respected figures such as Beck, Goerdeler, and former diplomat Ulrich von Hassel. The new regime would immediately negotiate an armistice with the Western Allies, while continuing to defend against the Soviet Union in the East. These aims reflected both moral opposition and pragmatic calculation, to save Germany from occupation and dismemberment. Security and secrecy became the greatest challenges. The circle of conspirators had to remain. The Gestapo's efficiency was well known, and every officer in the replacement army was aware that suspicion of disloyalty could result in immediate execution. Despite these dangers, Stauffenberg's position in Ulbricht's staff gave him direct access to the highest levels of command and the opportunity to attend briefings with Hitler. His blend of charisma, authority, and determination made him the ideal operative. Von Treschow, operating from the Eastern Front, continued to provide strategic guidance and maintained contacts with sympathetic generals. Communication between Berlin and the front relied on couriers and coded messages, each exchange carrying mortal risk. As winter turned to spring in 1944, preparations reached their final stage. The conspirators acquired British-made plastic explosives and designed portable. Meetings were held in Ulbricht's office under the guise of administrative discussions. Maps, orders, and troop lists were updated daily, ensuring that once the signal was given, reserve divisions would move within hours. Yet doubts persisted. Some officers feared that without Göring, Himmler, and other top figures eliminated simultaneously, the SS could still crush the coup. Others questioned whether the German people, conditioned by years of propaganda, would support any regime that killed Hitler. Despite these divisions, Stauffenberg pressed forward. He believed that action was both inevitable and necessary. Even if it failed, it would prove that not all Germans had followed their leader blindly into ruin. By June 1944, the conspirators' sense of urgency increased dramatically. The Allied landings in Normandy signaled that Germany was losing the war on both fronts. Hitler's growing isolation and erratic decision-making deepened the conspirators' conviction that the state was on the verge of collapse. Operation Valkyrie was no longer merely a plan. It was a last attempt to salvage the remnants of a nation from destruction. All that remained was to strike the decisive blow. In early July 1944, all elements of the conspiracy converged on one critical point: the assassination of Adolf Hitler during a scheduled military conference. Klaus von Stauffenberg, now Chief of Staff of the Reserve Army, had secured an appointment that granted him access to the Führer's headquarters for regular briefings. His new role placed him at the intersection of authority and opportunity. Each visit to the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia carried immense risk, but also the potential to end the war. The conspirators agreed that the plan must be executed immediately. Delay could mean discovery, and discovery meant death for all involved. The first attempt was set for 11 July 1944. Stauffenberg arrived at the Wolf's Lair carrying 2 British-made plastic explosives in his briefcase, along with time delay detonators. However, the meeting was postponed unexpectedly when Hitler rescheduled his briefings for the next day and shortened the duration. Because of constant surveillance and the limited time window between arming the bomb and detonation, about 10 to 15 minutes, Stauffenberg judged the circumstances too uncertain and aborted the mission. He returned to Berlin with the explosives still hidden in his case. The conspirators, though frustrated, interpreted the failed attempt as proof that the plan could be executed under the right conditions. 2 days later, on 15th of July, another opportunity arose. Stauffenberg again traveled to East Prussia. In Berlin, Olbricht prepared to activate Operation Valkyrie at the moment confirmation of Hitler's death arrived. However, the meeting at the Wolf's Lair ended abruptly before Stauffenberg could arm the bomb. Once again, he was forced to stand down. His colleagues urged him to try once more, but some now doubted that the plan could succeed. Hitler's personal security remained tight, and the conspirators' circle risked exposure with every delay. By mid-July, tension among the conspirators reached its peak. General Beck and Goerdeler pressed for action, arguing that hesitation would only invite arrest. Von Treschow, from his post at the Eastern Front, sent word that moral duty outweighed strategic calculation. The assassination must be attempted, even if it costs our lives. To act is the only proof that conscience still exists in Germany. These words reinforced Stauffenberg's resolve. On 20th of July 1944, he left Berlin once again for the Wolf's Lair, this time determined that there would be no further postponement. At approximately 10:15 a.m., Stauffenberg's plane landed at Rastenburg Airfield. He was accompanied by his adjutant, Lieutenant Werner von Haeften. Both carried a briefcase containing 2 charges of plastic explosive, detonators, and a pencil fuse designed to ignite after roughly 10 minutes. Shortly after arrival, they were informed that the conference would be held not in the usual reinforced bunker, but in a wooden barracks. The change, made because of the summer heat, would later prove decisive. At around 12:30 p.m., Stauffenberg excused himself to a side room, where he and von Haeften armed one of the bombs by crushing the copper end of the detonator capsule with pliers. Time constraints forced him to prepare only a single charge instead of both. Inside the conference hut, more than 20 officers and aides stood around a long oak table. Hitler was positioned at the far end, leaning over maps of the Eastern Front. Stauffenberg placed the briefcase near the Führer's right side, close to a thick table leg, and quietly excused himself under the pretext of a telephone call. Minutes later, he and von Haeften departed the compound. At 12:42 p.m., the bomb detonated, shattering the wooden structure and killing 4 officers. Dozens were injured. Hitler, however, survived with minor wounds, protected by the table leg and the open windows that vented the blast. Believing the explosion had succeeded, Stauffenberg and von Haeften drove to the airfield and flew back to Berlin. En route, radio communications were disrupted. Confirmation of Hitler's death never reached them. In the capital, Olbricht hesitated to activate Valkyrie without absolute proof. Hours passed in confusion as Did Stauffenberg arrive at the Bendler Block headquarters and declare that Hitler was dead? He ordered the operation to begin, convinced that success depended on swift action. Telegrams were sent to regional commands across Germany, instructing reserve units to secure government buildings and arrest SS personnel. For a brief moment, the coup seemed possible. But as evening fell, news arrived that Hitler had survived. Radio broadcasts from the Wolf's Lair carried his voice to the nation, describing the attack as the work of a small band of criminal officers. The momentum in Berlin collapsed instantly. Confusion turned to panic. Many officers withdrew their support, unwilling to oppose a living Führer. By midnight, SS troops surrounded the Bendler block. General Fromm, commander of the replacement army, who had initially hesitated to choose sides, ordered the immediate arrest of Stauffenberg and his closest associates. Within hours, the coup had failed, and its leaders faced summary execution before the dawn of the next day. In the early hours of 21st July 1944, the brief hope that Germany might free itself from dictatorship ended in violence. At the Bendler block in Berlin, where the conspirators had established their command post, SS units and loyal troops surrounded the building. Inside, confusion and disbelief gave way to grim acceptance. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, General Friedrich Olbricht, Colonel Albrecht Merz von Quirnheim, and Lieutenant Werner von Haeften were taken into custody by General Friedrich Fromm, who sought to protect himself by appearing loyal to Hitler. After a short improvised court-martial, Fromm declared them guilty of treason and ordered their execution. At approximately 00:30 on 21st July, the four men were shot in the courtyard by a firing squad. Stauffenberg's last recorded words were, "Long live sacred Germany." Within hours, their bodies were cremated and their ashes scattered to prevent any future commemoration. Elsewhere in Germany, the consequences of the failed coup unfolded rapidly. The Gestapo, acting on orders from Heinrich Himmler, launched an extensive investigation that uncovered the full scope of the conspiracy. Thousands of officers, civil servants, and civilians were arrested within days. Among them were Ludwig Beck, Karl Goerdeler, and other leading figures of the resistance. Beck attempted suicide when captured but died shortly after. Goerdeler was interrogated for months before being executed in February 1945. Von Treschow, serving on the Eastern Front, chose to take his own life rather than be captured. Within 3 weeks, more than 200 individuals had been executed. By the end of the year, that number would exceed. The regime's response was designed not only to punish, but to intimidate. Special courts known as the Volksgerichtshof People's Court conducted public trials led by Judge Roland Freisler. Defendants were humiliated, shouted down, and often sentenced to death within minutes. Many were hanged with piano wire, and films of these executions were shown privately to Hitler and senior officials. The propaganda machine portrayed the conspirators as traitors, aristocratic elitists, and agents of the enemy. Newspapers emphasized their supposed cowardice and corruption, describing the plot as an attack on Germany's unity during wartime. The message was clear. Loyalty to the Führer was synonymous with patriotism, and dissent equaled treason. In military circles, the purge extended far beyond those directly involved. Dozens of senior officers were dismissed, imprisoned, or executed, including Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben and General Eduard Wagner. The army's autonomy, already eroded, was effectively destroyed. Control of the replacement army passed to Himmler, ensuring that the SS dominated both internal security and the armed forces. Surveillance within the Wehrmacht intensified, and morale declined as trust between officers disappeared. Hitler used the failed coup to justify even harsher measures of repression, claiming divine protection as proof of his destiny. Despite the regime's efforts to obliterate the memory of the plotters, fragments of their actions survived in private conversations and personal letters. Some within the army viewed Stauffenberg and his colleagues not as traitors, but as men who had acted from conscience. Yet the majority remained silent, fearing association with the condemned. In the months that followed, Germany continued to fight despite inevitable defeat. The resistance had failed to achieve its immediate goal, but it revealed that moral opposition to Hitler existed within the very institutions that sustained his power. For the conspirators, the decision to act had been rooted in both ethics and strategy. They knew success was unlikely. The state apparatus of terror was too strong, and public loyalty to Hitler too deep. Still, they believed that history required an attempt, a demonstration that not all Germans shared responsibility for the crimes of the regime. The coup's failure thus became symbolic rather than tactical, an act of sacrifice rather than revolution. It represented a moment when conscience briefly challenged tyranny and paid the ultimate price. By late 1944, as Allied forces advanced on all fronts, Hitler's regime grew increasingly paranoid and vindictive. The executions continued until the war's final weeks, silencing nearly every surviving. Yet the moral resonance of 20th of July endured beyond the lives of its participants. What began as a military operation transformed into one of the most significant moral gestures of the war. An attempt to reclaim German honor at a time when honor had nearly ceased to exist. The collapse of Operation Valkyrie reshaped the final phase of the war inside Germany. Hitler emerged from the assassination attempt not weakened, but more entrenched than before. He presented his survival as divine confirmation of his destiny and used the event to tighten his control over both the military and the civilian population. In speeches broadcast across the Reich, he declared that "Providence has spared me once again for my mission," framing the conspirators as instruments of foreign intelligence and moral corruption. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels coordinated an immediate campaign to portray the coup as a betrayal by a handful of degenerate aristocrats and cowardly officers. The message was relentlessly repeated across radio, newspapers, and newsreels, turning the failed uprising into a weapon of psychological warfare. Within days, loyalty oaths were renewed across the Wehrmacht. Officers and soldiers were required to publicly reaffirm their allegiance to Hitler, often before entire units. The slightest expression of sympathy for the conspirators became grounds for arrest. Military police and SS agents patrolled barracks and staff offices, watching for dissent. The failed coup provided Himmler with the justification to dismantle the remaining independence of the army. On 24 July, he assumed direct command of the replacement army, previously the conspirators' main operational base. Under his control, the SS penetrated every level of the armed forces, ensuring that political reliability replaced competence as the key criterion for advancement. The wave of repression extended beyond the army. The Gestapo initiated one of the largest investigations in the history of the regime, compiling nearly 7,000 interrogation files. Informants were rewarded, denunciations encouraged. Families of the accused were punished under the doctrine of Sippenhaft, kin liability, meaning relatives could be imprisoned or executed for the actions of their kin. Wives, brothers, and children of conspirators such as Stauffenberg, Ulbricht, and Tresckow were arrested and sent to concentration camps. Even distant acquaintances faced interrogation. The result was a climate of pervasive fear, where silence became the only form of survival. Meanwhile, the People's Court intensified its campaign of terror. Between August 1944 and February 1945, more than 200 trials were held under Roland Freisler's supervision. His courtroom became a stage for ideological theater. Defendants were insulted, stripped of dignity, and condemned in sessions lasting less than an hour. On 8 August, Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben was executed alongside several other generals, his hanging filmed for Hitler's private viewing. These spectacles were never released publicly, but served as internal propaganda within the regime, reinforcing the message that mercy was treason. Politically, the aftermath of Valkyrie produced a paradox. While the regime eliminated real and imagined opponents, its internal cohesion continued to erode. The SS gained authority, but the administrative chaos of the collapsing war economy deepened. Goebbels attempted to transform the failed coup into a... Yet beneath the slogans, many Germans privately recognized that the war was lost. The myth of Hitler's invincibility persisted in propaganda, but the reality on the front lines told a different story. The Red Army advanced through Eastern Europe, and Allied bombers reduced German cities to ruins. In the surviving resistance circles, despair mingled with a sense of vindication. Some officers who had not been discovered tried to continue isolated efforts to negotiate with the Allies, but no government outside Germany was willing to treat with individuals lacking authority. The British and Americans viewed all internal conspiracies as too weak to alter the course of the war. The failure of 20th of July thus marked the end of organized military resistance. What remained were scattered personal gestures, individual refusals to obey criminal orders, small acts of humanity amid destruction. Hitler exploited the moment to transform himself once more into a symbol rather than a leader. He rarely appeared in public after the bombing, but his image filled every newspaper front page. The photographic evidence of his minor injuries, bandaged arm, ripped trousers, was used to depict miraculous survival. Phrases like, "The Führer lives and leads," became mandatory slogans in factories and schools. Even as defeat loomed, the cult of personality intensified, driven by the fear that acknowledging weakness would shatter the regime entirely. By late 1944, Germany existed in a state of ideological exhaustion. The purge following Valkyrie had destroyed what remained of internal debate. The army had become an obedient instrument of a collapsing government, while the population oscillated between resignation and fatalistic loyalty. The coup's failure, intended to liberate Germany from dictatorship, instead it allowed Hitler to finish his war in absolute control, isolated, delusional, but unchallenged. The price was catastrophic, not only the loss of millions more lives, but also the silencing of the last organized voice of conscience within the Third Reich. As the repression deepened after July 1944, the surviving fragments of the German resistance faced a new and harsher reality. The Gestapo's investigations spread like a net across the Reich, uncovering connections between military officers, diplomats, clergy, and industrialists who had once shared quiet opposition to the regime. The number of arrests exceeded 7,000, and hundreds were executed without trial. Yet despite this wave of terror, isolated forms of resistance continued, some driven by conscience, others by desperation. The months that followed were marked by small, scattered acts of defiance that revealed both the persistence of moral opposition and the futility of organized rebellion under total surveillance. In the army, surviving sympathizers of the Valkyrie network attempted to protect one another through falsified reports and destroyed documents. Officers, such as General Hans Speidel and General Karl Heinrich von Stülpnagel, managed to obscure their roles in the conspiracy long enough to avoid immediate execution, though many were later arrested. In occupied France, Stülpnagel had briefly arrested members of the SS following the 20th July explosion, believing Hitler to be dead. His miscalculation cost him his position and ultimately his life. Others, such as General Erwin Rommel, became indirectly entangled in the aftermath. Though Rommel had not participated in the assassination plot, his name was mentioned under interrogation by several suspects. His death was publicly announced as the result of war wounds, and he was buried with full military honors, a final act of propaganda masking yet another internal purge. Beyond the military, civilian opposition continued in muted form. Members of the Kreisau Circle who had survived the initial arrests, including Helmuth James von Moltke, maintained contact through secret correspondence until their eventual capture in early 1945. Moltke's trial before the People's Court demonstrated the regime's determination to suppress not only action, but thought itself. He was condemned for the crime of planning a moral renewal of Germany, a charge reflecting the regime's fear of intellectual dissent. His execution in January 1945 symbolized the extinction of organized moral opposition within the Reich. At the same time, the Catholic and Protestant churches faced renewed pressure to display. Bishops who had previously protested the euthanasia program or anti-clerical policies now fell silent, fearing mass reprisals. Nonetheless, isolated clergy continued to voice resistance. The Jesuit father Alfred Delp and Lutheran pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer, both connected to the broader anti-Nazi circles, were imprisoned and executed in the final months of the war. Their writings from captivity expressed a recurring theme among the defeated conspirators, that moral duty existed even without hope of success. The general population, subjected to relentless propaganda, responded to the coup's failure with a mix of fear, resignation, and confusion. Many Germans were unaware of the true nature of the plot, believing official claims that it had been orchestrated by foreign agents. The bombardment of cities and the advance of Allied armies left civilians focused on survival rather than politics. Yet private diaries and post-war testimonies reveal that some citizens began to question the regime more openly after the failed assassination. The very fact that senior officers had tried to remove Hitler suggested that the myth of his infallibility was breaking apart. Still, without organization or leadership, public dissent remained impossible. By late 1944 and early 1945, the final remnants of the resistance existed only as personal conscience within a collapsing state. The Gestapo continued its purges, even as Allied forces approached German territory. In February 1945, the last group of convicted conspirators, including Karl Goerdeler and Fabian von Schlabrendorf, faced execution at Plötzensee prison. Only a few survived by chance or by the regime's disintegration in the war's final days. Among them was Schlabrendorf, whose execution was postponed due to an air raid and who lived to testify after the war. The moral and strategic failure of Operation Valkyrie left the resistance fragmented, yet its significance grew in retrospect. Among those who survived, there was a shared recognition that the attempt had been doomed by structural realities: Hitler's total control of the military, the population's indoctrination, and the absence of Allied support. Still, the conspirators' act of rebellion stood as proof that opposition, however limited, had existed within the core of the regime's apparatus. In the ruins of the Reich, their legacy began to acquire a new meaning. The idea that Germans had acted too late, but from conviction, would later serve as a foundation for post-war efforts to separate moral responsibility from collective guilt. As 1945 approached, with cities in flames and millions displaced, the surviving threads of resistance no longer sought to change the outcome of the war. Their struggle had become internal, an effort to preserve human dignity amid collapse. In this silent, scattered resistance lay the final echo of the moral defiance that had once sought to end tyranny with a single act of courage in a wooden conference room in East Prussia. By the beginning of 1945, the remnants of the Third Reich were collapsing under the combined pressure of Allied advances from both East and West. Yet even in its final months, the regime maintained its machinery of repression, determined to extinguish all traces of dissent. The shadow of the 20 July conspiracy continued to dominate internal policy. The Gestapo and SS pursued suspects long after the main conspirators were dead, compiling detailed dossiers for a post-war purification that never occurred. Thousands of individuals remained imprisoned without trial. The People's Court, under Roland Freisler, continued its work until the last weeks of the war. Freisler himself was killed during an air raid on Berlin in February. His death marked the symbolic end of Nazi justice, but not of the terror it represented. Within the Wehrmacht, morale deteriorated rapidly. The army was exhausted, its leadership decimated by losses and purges. Officers feared both the enemy and their own government. Field units on the Eastern Front received orders to fight to the last man, even when encircled, while the SS and party officials executed anyone suspected of defeatism. The moral crisis that had driven the conspirators to act in 1944 now spread through the ranks. Soldiers who once swore personal loyalty to Hitler saw their divisions destroyed and their families displaced by the advancing Red Army. Yet open resistance remained impossible. The memory of the July plot served as a warning. Opposition meant annihilation. Inside Germany, propaganda continued to present a fantasy of resilience. Goebbels' broadcasts insisted that the Führer was leading a miraculous counterattack and that faith would deliver salvation. Public information about the July conspirators was still circulated, now framed as a cautionary tale. They had betrayed the nation and doomed it to disaster. Portraits of Stauffenberg and Beck appeared in pamphlets with the label Verräter, traitor. Even at this late stage, The regime sought to maintain control through hatred, channeling public suffering into loyalty. Nevertheless, fragments of conscience survived even in this atmosphere. Individual officers and local administrators quietly ignored orders to destroy infrastructure or execute civilians during retreats. In some areas, commanders negotiated local surrender. These acts, though uncoordinated, reflected the same moral reasoning that had once driven Operation Valkyrie, that duty to humanity could outweigh obedience to the state. The difference was that by 1945, such gestures occurred without hope of recognition or success. They were expressions of exhaustion rather than rebellion. Among the prisoners still held for their connection to the resistance were the families of executed conspirators. In camps such as Sachsenhausen and Buchenwald, relatives of Stauffenberg, Tresckow, and others endured collective punishment. Some, including Stauffenberg's widow Nina and several of their children, survived only because the camps were overrun by Allied troops in the spring. Others perished in forced marches as the SS evacuated prisoners ahead of advancing armies. The persecution of these families illustrated the regime. Hitler's final orders before his death in April 1945 included instructions to destroy all remaining records of the conspirators' trials and correspondence. When Hitler committed suicide on 30th April 1945, the structure of repression disintegrated almost immediately. In Berlin, surviving members of the military administration attempted to surrender, while in the occupied zones, Allied authorities began to uncover the full scope of the July purges. Documents retrieved from Gestapo archives revealed extensive evidence of the resistance networks, including transcripts of interrogations and confiscated correspondence. For the first time, the names of the conspirators were recorded not as criminals, but as witnesses to a different Germany. Yet their story remained largely unknown to the devastated population, preoccupied with survival in a landscape of ruins. The Allied occupation authorities, particularly the British and Americans, showed initial caution. While they acknowledged the moral courage of the conspirators, they also viewed the resistance as limited in scale and too late to affect the war's outcome. It was only as denazification progressed that Operation Valkyrie began to be re-evaluated. Interrogations of surviving officers and the discovery of diaries and letters, especially those of Tresckow, Goerdeler, and Moltke, revealed the depth of their motivations. Their opposition had not been opportunistic, but rooted in the conviction that Germany's redemption required self-liberation from tyranny. By the end of 1945, the conspirators' surviving associates faced a new challenge: to preserve the memory of what had happened. In a nation divided between defeat, guilt, and occupation, they sought to frame the events of 20th July not as a failed coup, but as a moment of moral clarity. The war's end closed the physical chapter of the conspiracy, but opened a new struggle over interpretation: how to define courage, loyalty, and betrayal in a society that had experienced all three in devastating measure. After Germany's unconditional surrender in May 1945, the story of the 20 July plot entered a new and uncertain phase. The conspirators were dead, their families scattered, and their documents confiscated by Allied investigators. Yet, as the occupation authorities began reconstructing German political life, the question of resistance gained unexpected importance. How could a society that had followed Hitler into catastrophe redefine itself without acknowledging those who had tried to oppose him? Operation Valkyrie, once condemned as treason, gradually became a symbol through which post-war Germany sought moral continuity with its own past. In the immediate aftermath, in the Soviet-controlled East, official narratives dismissed the conspirators as representatives of the same conservative elite that had empowered Hitler. Communist historians argued that their motive had been not moral opposition, but fear of defeat and revolution. The East German government, founded in 1949, celebrated only leftist resistance, especially that of communist groups such as the Red Orchestra and anti-fascist partisans. The July conspirators were largely erased from public commemoration for decades, their memory preserved only in private circles and among church communities. In the Western zones, the process of re-evaluation began earlier but remained cautious. The Allied authorities initially viewed the resistance with skepticism, regarding it as too limited to absolve the broader population from responsibility. British and American intelligence reports emphasized that the conspirators had acted too late to change the war's outcome. However, as denazification progressed, and as the new West German state sought moral foundations distinct from the Nazi past, public interest in the resistance revived. Surviving participants such as Fabian von Schlabrendorf and Eugen Gerstenmaier began to speak publicly about their motives, emphasizing the ethical dimension of their actions rather than the military one. Their testimonies helped transform the perception of 20th of July from a failed coup into a moral statement of conscience. During the 1950s, this reinterpretation was institutionalized. The Federal Republic of Germany recognized the conspirators as patriots who had acted to restore law and humanity. Monuments were erected, and school curricula began to include their story as part of a broader narrative of moral awakening. Annual ceremonies were introduced, attended by high-ranking government officials and military officers. This commemoration served a dual purpose: to honor individual courage and to demonstrate that the new German army, the Bundeswehr, would be founded on democratic, not authoritarian principles. Yet public opinion remained divided. Many former Wehrmacht officers and civilians, shaped by wartime propaganda, continued to view Stauffenberg and his fellow conspirators as traitors. The argument that a soldier's duty is obedience persisted well into the 1960s. For these groups, the coup's failure validated their belief in loyalty over conscience. Only gradually, through public debates, films, and historical research, did this perception begin to change. The Cold War also influenced interpretation. In the West, the July plot was portrayed as evidence that another Germany had existed, one that could align with democratic Europe. In the East, it remained suppressed as an expression of bourgeois opportunism. By the late 20th century, the resistance of 20th of July had become a cornerstone of Germany's post-war identity. Presidents, chancellors, and military leaders invoked Stauffenberg's name in speeches as a reminder of moral responsibility and civic courage. The plotters were no longer isolated figures, but symbols of a collective conscience that had survived dictatorship. Each year on the anniversary of the attempt, new officers of the Bundeswehr swore their oath in the same courtyard where Stauffenberg was executed, a deliberate act linking modern service to the principle of lawful resistance against tyranny. Internationally, Operation Valkyrie. Historians debated whether the conspirators' motives were primarily patriotic, ethical, or pragmatic, but consensus emerged that their actions demonstrated the limits of obedience and the cost of conscience. The moral dilemma they embodied, when to disobey for the sake of humanity, resonated far beyond Germany's borders. By the century's end, the once forbidden names of Beck, Treschow, and Stauffenberg had entered textbooks, streets, and public memorials. What began as a desperate act against an all-powerful regime had evolved into a defining element of national self-reflection. In both moral and historical terms, Operation Valkyrie came to signify the moment when conscience briefly defied power, and though defeated, ultimately outlived it. The legacy of Operation Valkyrie continued to evolve long after the war, shaping not only Germany's understanding of its past, but also the global discourse on resistance and moral responsibility. In the decades following 1945, historians, philosophers, and political leaders returned repeatedly to the question of what the conspirators represented. Were they patriots seeking to save their country, or moral reformers seeking to redeem humanity from complicity in genocide? The debate reflected the broader challenge of post-war identity: how to reconcile national history with the need for universal accountability. During the 1960s and 1970s, as a new generation of Germans came of age, interest in the resistance grew alongside a more critical examination of the Nazi period. Students and intellectuals, questioning the silence of their parents' generation, discovered in the July conspirators a complex moral example. They were not flawless heroes, but individuals who had struggled with the same questions of loyalty, obedience, and conscience that had defined the era. Their story became part of a larger effort to confront the past, Vergangenheitsbewältigung. Academic research deepened understanding of the resistance networks, revealing the diversity of motives, religious, ethical, political, and pragmatic, that had united people from the military, the clergy, and the civil service. The result was a more nuanced view that rejected both wartime propaganda and early post-war simplifications. In the Cold War context, interpretations of the 20 July plot diverged sharply between East and West. In East Germany, the conspirators were officially dismissed as reactionary elites seeking to preserve capitalism. State propaganda glorified communist partisans as the true anti-fascists, while the names of Stauffenberg and Beck remained absent from monuments and textbooks. In the West, however, the plot came to symbolize democratic values and the rebirth of a moral Germany. The Bundeswehr adopted the concept of innere Führung, leadership through moral responsibility, directly inspired by the lessons of the resistance. Soldiers were taught that their duty extended beyond obedience to orders, encompassing accountability to law and conscience. This principle, enshrined in military education, became one of the most enduring legacies of the failed coup. Cultural representations further shaped public memory. Films, plays, and literature from the 1950s onward portrayed the events of July 1944 in increasingly human terms. Early dramatizations emphasized heroism and sacrifice, while later works, such as the 2008 film Valkyrie, explored the conspirators' inner conflicts and the atmosphere of fear that surrounded them. These portrayals brought the story to global audiences, reframing it as a universal meditation on moral courage under dictatorship. International recognition also grew. Memorials in France, Britain, and the United States acknowledged that, within Nazi Germany, a small group had risked everything to end tyranny. The Bendler Block courtyard became not only a national memorial, but a site of reflection on ethical duty. Each year, political and military leaders reaffirmed the continuity between democratic institutions and the moral resistance of 1944. The ceremony of Bundeswehr officer cadets taking their oath there symbolized the integration of historical responsibility into the nation's civic identity. Streets, schools, and military bases were named after the conspirators, transforming what had once been considered betrayal into a cornerstone of democratic patriotism. Over time, the historical evaluation of Operation Valkyrie settled into a consensus that its participants acted out of a complex mix of pragmatism and moral conviction, and that their failure revealed not futility, but courage. Their example became a moral reference point in later discussions of resistance within totalitarian systems, invoked in debates about obedience, conscience, and the limits of state power. Today, the events of 20 July 1944 occupy a distinct place in world memory. They stand not only as a chapter of German history, but as a reminder of the human capacity for moral awakening amid corruption and terror. The conspirators did not end the war, but their act restored a measure of dignity to a nation drowning in violence. Their story continues to challenge future generations with a question that transcends time and borders. When authority becomes criminal, what is the true meaning of duty? In that question lies the enduring power of Operation Valkyrie, not as a tale of failure, but as a testament to the idea that conscience, once awakened, can outlive the regime that sought to destroy it.